Welcome, everyone, to Coffee with a Codex. My name is Dot Porter, and I am a curator in the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts in the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. I split my time between the Kislak Center and the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, or SIMS. SIMS is a research and development group that's in the Kislak Center, and we do lots of different manuscript things. We have obviously our physical collections, one item of which we'll be looking at today, but we also digitize all of our collection, and we take part in a lot of manuscript related digital humanities projects. So that's who I am and what I'm doing. If you're new to Coffee with a Codex, welcome. It's always great to see new people come in. And if you've been here before, welcome back. It's always a pleasure to see people come again. I've been hearing a lot of people coming in, so I'm going to share the links one more time. And then I'm going to do a dramatic unboxing, which is always fun. So the manuscript we're going to be looking at today is shelf mark LJS 280. This means that it's in the Schoenberg collection. All of our LJS manuscripts are from the Schoenberg collection. This was a collection, was collected by Lawrence Schoenberg, and he donated the collection to our library over sort of a period of several years. So this is one of them. This is not actually the book though. This is what's called a clamshell box. It's so called because it opens like a clamshell, and we keep this in here. So I'm going to open it up, and we're going to take a look at what this LJS 280 has going on. So here we go. It is not particularly big. You can see my palm sort of covers it up, and I don't have particularly large hands. But this is interesting, both physically and for the content. So I want to try to talk a little bit about both. It has a chain binding. This means that there is literally a chain attached to it. You can hear that. And so that's why it has this special box, because we want to make sure that it's stored safely. So I'm going to set this aside and bring the book back. So here we go, LJS 280. It is a 13th century manuscript, but like a lot of the manuscripts that we look at, a lot of manuscripts that survive and that are in our collection, come on, straighten out, there we go. It's not only from the 13th century. So the binding and the chain are later from two different time periods. So let's take a quick look inside at the 13th century. So the main text here was written in the 13th century. We're going to see other text that was added later. So for example, the inside binding here has some text that was written in the 15th century. And what else was done in the 15th century? The binding was added. This current binding actually was added in the 15th century. So it was written in the 13th century. It was used over the next several hundred years. Why? Okay, so what is the text? This is the other important thing. The text is the decretals that were ordered by Gregory IX, Pope Gregory IX. And these decretals were incredibly important in the history of the Catholic Church. So I've done a little bit of reading. There might be folks on the call who actually know more about this. And if you want to add information, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat. I'm always happy to answer questions, by the way, as we go. If you have questions or things that you want to add, please go ahead and put them in the chat. So the decretals were ordered in 1230, because before then there were several different sets of decretals, that is sort of the laws of the Catholic Church. And Gregory IX was like, well, I want a new set that sort of brings everything together, that codifies it. And part of that was strengthening the Pope, the role of the Pope in the Church and in Europe, essentially. So a decretal is like a law. my understanding is it's basically like a canon. This is a book of canon law. So it's the law of the Catholic Church. And so Gregory appointed Raymond of Pen to do this work. And over the course of 4 years, Raymond went through the existing books of canon law and also through the archive of Gregory IX himself, and put together this new set of laws. And this was used through the Middle Ages and up. I have seen the date 1917, that these same sets of canon laws were actually used up until the 20th century, which explains why we have a 13th century text block, that is this part here, in a 15th century binding, and then a later, things later going on. So I am taking a look at the chat. Oh, Juliet, export the chat so that you have a copy. I can also send those to you after if you want to email me. I can do that. Heidi wants to know how the chain is attached. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to turn this over. So remember, 15th century binding. And here we go. So the chain is attached to a metal boss that has been tacked into the binding, which is wood. So it's I think it's beech, but it's solid wood. It has sheepskin over it. So that it's attached here. And then the way that it would have worked is, in a library, there would have been either a stick that would go through this that would then be attached, or it could just be sort of attached to some kind of thing. Actually, one of the links that I shared with you is a blog post that's about chained libraries. There are actually some surviving libraries that have chained books in them. And so you can take a look there for photos of how that would have worked. But it was a way to essentially keep people from walking away with a book. And on the other hand, it was a method for making books more available to people in sort of an odd way. So this chain, and I'll say more about that in a second, this chain was actually added to this binding, we think, in the 17th century. So the binding existed for, a couple of hundred years before the chain was added. In the 17th century, this manuscript was, we know, in a library in Cologne. And we know that because there is a note here that I'm going to show you. It's on 6 verso, down here in the margin. Here, actually, I'm gonna bring over I don't like these, they're ugly, but it's easier to hold the book together. Let's see. So we're going to go to 6 recto. Somebody put a little note in the margin that said, this manuscript is in this particular library in Cologne. And I will see. Make sure, maybe I'll do it this way. I want to make sure we get a nice little look at this, because it is interesting that so this little note here says we're in the library of St. Martin Major in Cologne. So this was the library that it was in when the chain, we think, when the chain was attached in the 17th century. So it was still being used even at that time, even though the book itself by that point was a few hundred years old. All right. So it was there in use until the 19th century, we know, because there is a list of books that were in that library in 1843. And then at some point after that, it was taken out of the library and sold. And Sam Fogg had it in 1998, and then Lawrence Schoenberg bought it from him, and then he gave it to us in the 2000s. So that's sort of the long provenance of this manuscript. It was written in France in the later 13th century, so some years after the decretals were put together. The writing that I pointed out on the facing page here is a sort of table of contents, and it was added in the 15th century. So around the same time that the binding was added, it was put in. I just want to say one more thing about the binding before I forget. You might have noticed that the front of the binding is much darker than the back of the binding. The reason for that is because it was in a fire. The book didn't burn, but you can see that the smoke caused damage to the front cover and also to the edges of the pages. So as we're looking through, you'll see that the edges of the pages, especially at the front, are quite dark, and the inside as well. And that's because it was hot and there was smoke. And that's what's happening there. And the reason that the back is not damaged is because it was lying on its back, right? Because it had been chained. It was chained to something, and it would have been sitting, instead of being like up on a shelf, it would have been sitting like on a table. And so that's why the damage is the way that it is, which is kind of cool because it gives us a sense of how the book was used. There we go. So the decretals are divided into 5 books, and we sort of open up. We have the 15th century tables of contents here. We have the list of them here. And if you've been here before, if you've looked at other manuscripts, you know that this sort of going back and forth between red and blue is a really typical thing to do to help us keep track of where we are in our lists. And when we get into the text, you'll see again this sort of alternating red and blue there. And these are numbered here. And I think this is divided into the books. So here's book 1, the list for book 1. This is going to be book 2, book 3, and book 4 starts here, and then book 5, and then we're done. So we've got 5 books. The decretals are listed and numbered. I think that, so this is described as abbreviated. So I think that our copy is not the complete copy. So I think that there are other copies of these decretals that have more, I think. That's what that means, but it's sort of not clear. It's pretty plain. There are a few illuminated initials. So there was one here in the contents list, and then we have one at the start of each book. So this is the opening of book 1, and we have this illuminated initial, but some of them are missing. There are many leaves that have been taken out. Interestingly, for me, because I'm interested in the structure of books, they're taken out in pairs. That is, manuscripts like this are made of sheets of parchment. So this is made of animal skin. Sheets of parchment that were folded together and made into little booklets that we call quires, or sometimes gatherings. And then these are sewn together. And sometimes, often when leaves are missing, they've been cut out. It's like if I took a razor and I cut a leaf out, and you can sort of sometimes see that there's a stub. So you can see where a leaf was cut. In the case of this book, though, its whole sheets have been taken out, which implies that the book was in pieces when these sheets were removed. And why they were removed is sort of an open question. Some of them that are missing would have included illuminated initials, but they're not like the nicest, they're not super pretty. I don't know. I kind of like this manuscript because it is sort of, I don't know, the writing is pretty clear and it's very nicely laid out. And when we get to the rubrication, we do have this nice blue and red, and the initials, the larger initials, although they're not illuminated, they do have some nice pen work around them. But it's not really designed to be a fancy manuscript. It's not like a Bible or a book of hours, you know, where you're used to seeing this. This was a book that was meant to be referred to see, well, what is the law about one thing or the other thing. And we'll also see that the margins are quite wide. And if you've been with us before, you know that oftentimes, when you see a book with very wide margins, the implication is that it was made to be written in. And in fact, we have some marginal notes here, but not a lot. There's a lot of room here, you know, for that people could have come in and added more notes. And they didn't really, considering how long this book was used for. You know, it was used from the time it was made actively up until the 19th century. You might expect to see more writing in it, and you don't, which is kind of interesting, I think. I just want to point out here, and I've seen a couple of others of these, that if we look down here, there is a something going on here in the parchment. This is a case where when the parchment was actually being made, like when the skins were attached to a frame and were being stretched out, there was a hole there. And so what the parchment maker did is sewed it up. And so as the parchment was drying and curing, it was this would have been holding that hole together. And then the thread comes out and you're left with this little, almost like a scar, even though it's not really a scar, right? Because the animal was already dead when this happened. But I love seeing those. It's like, I don't know. I like being reminded that this used to be, you know, on a cow. Maybe that's just me, but I kind of like that. So here we are, we're in book 1, and we'll go to book 2. I can't remember if there's an illuminated initial in book 2. Here's some more interesting parchment stuff. So there's another scar here. There's also little dots up in the corner. If you see little dots like that, those are hair follicles. So yeah, Frankenstein's. I do think about Frankenstein actually when I saw this. I saw a tweet earlier today actually that was really neat, that had embroidery. And so there was still colored thread. And you do see that sometimes, sometimes there's still thread there. And I don't think there's thread. No, the thread's been taken out. But sometimes you'll see that there's still thread there, which is pretty neat. So those were the little dots were hair follicles. You don't always see them, especially if the parchment has been really nicely, I guess, or really well made. If parchment's very nice, you can't tell the difference between the hair and the flesh side, but this isn't quite that nice. Let's see, so I'm still, we went to book 2. I wasn't paying attention. So I think that there is no, right. So here we are, we're going from 1 to 2, and it's in the middle of a sentence and there's no initial. So there's something missing. There's a page or maybe a couple of pages that are missing here. So that's interesting, but I think, here's another one. And you know what? I think that has thread in it. I think that still has thread. Oop, come on. That still has thread in it. Can you see that? That is very cool. And it's survived because that's 12th century, or sorry, 13th century thread right there. Yeah, I think that's pretty neat. Okay. And another thing, I'm looking for this book 2 to book 3. Oh, this is weird. I noticed this earlier when I was looking through it. There's a note down here in the bottom margin and it's written upside down. I didn't look to see what exactly that says, but it's sort of early. that is a medieval note, I think, but it's upside down. So I don't know. And there's more notes. Lots of people wrote in this over a long period of time, and nobody wrote a whole lot, which I just think that's so neat. But while I'm looking for this book smells. I don't know if it's because it was in a fire, but when I'm done with this, I'm gonna have to go wash my hands because it really stinks. Okay, here we go. So this is what it looked like originally, going from one book to the other. So we have book 2 over here. We also have these numbers in the margin. If you remember, I'll even turn back to remind you. In this section at the front, we have each one of these is numbered. And then when you get in here, then we have the numbers here. So this is like, it's basically like a table of contents or an index. So it's a way to easily find if you're looking at the front, and then you can come back and look at this. So, but here we are, we're going from 2 to 3. We have the explicit, this is saying the end of book 3, and then the start of, or sorry, the end of book 2, right? And the start of book 3. This is later. That's interesting. This little thing here is like a paragraph marker, but this is certainly, that's probably 17th century. There, that's. So it's, I don't know, it's so interesting to me that it doesn't have more notes in it. It has notes in it, but not like a lot of them. All right, so now we're going to go from 3 to 4. Ooh, and here's more parchment. I love it when parchment does this. So sometimes, usually they're pretty careful about getting sheets that are all the same size, so that so that the text block is sort of a consistent size. But sometimes you have to make do. And so what this is these are just pieces of parchment that were shorter than other ones, and they've been gone ahead and been used anyway. But what you end up with is these sort of curved, because these haven't been trimmed the way these edges have. So the edges of the pages have been sort of cut. These haven't been cut. And so this is the shape of the skin. And you can see this would have been like a probably an armpit of the animal here. And I think let's see if I can get you to see this. There's some structural stuff happening here. If I zoom in, you might be able to see that there is thread here. Can you see that? Maybe here, there's a little bit of thread. This is the thread that's holding the book together. It's actually down the center of this quire. So this is the top sheet, and you can see that physically this is connected to this. Oh, no, you can't, because there we go. This is a single sheet. And then the one below it is also a single sheet. You can see that because the angle of the parchment coming down here and then down here. And so you normally can't see that because the sheets are trimmed to be the same size. So it's kind of neat when you can see the way that the book is put together by looking at the shape of the parchment pages. All right, so we've gone from 3 to 4. There's at least one. I think there's one more initial. Let's see if we can find it before we finish. Here's book 4, 4 to 5. I know you're here. 4. Something is going on here. I can't figure out what's up with this parchment. If it's something, because you can see this is really, it's like the ink is almost showing through it, and the parchment itself is kind of translucent in a way that isn't normal. I don't know what's happening there, but he just wrote over it. Just wrote right over it. And then we're back to sort of better parchment that you can't see through. Here we go. Going from is this book 4 to 5? Yep, 4 to 5. So here is the end of book 4. And then book 5 is starting with an initial. Let's skip over. Here we so you can see that a little better. This initial, and I thought this was fun, the way that they're using 5. Usually 5 would be a distinctive V, but it's a U, which U's and V's, of course, were used interchangeably. It's just odd for me to see U being used as a number, as 5. I think that seems unusual to me. I don't know. Maybe people who look at, maybe it was something for the 13th century decretals, more normal. Let's see. Here's more of these later paragraph markings that have been added there, just sort of interesting. And here's, I noticed this earlier too, this has actually been cut out. You can see there's an edge here, and there's a section at the bottom that's been cut out. And I don't know why. Maybe there was something written in there that somebody wanted to have taken out. Sometimes you see that in manuscripts where there's a lot of writing, or if there's marginal illustrations, and you can say, well, maybe they were cutting out an illustration. But in something like this where it's so plain, it's sort of hard to know why they might have cut that out. So I'm just going to keep, we still have a couple minutes. Does anyone have any questions or something you'd like to see up close? We could take another look at the binding if that would be interesting. I might do that just to see. One thing that's sort of fun that I'm seeing here is the prick marks for the framing. So if you look, I'll zoom in so you can see. If we look at the bottom of the page, you can see these 3 little dots here. These are little holes in the parchment. And if we go to the top, we'll see that there are, in fact, 3 more little holes at the top. And then there are lines drawn between the holes. And this is a really typical way that scribes would lay out the page, by making these holes on the sides and then drawing lines between them. Usually you see prick marks down the edge of the page, and that they're drawn this way. And I don't see those here, but they see them at the top. So that's sort of a unusual and kind of an interesting thing here. Yeah, even in the back, I think this is maybe water. Maybe that's from the fire too. And then across the top, it's quite dark on the edge. I will take one more look at the binding because I think the binding is so neat. Here we go. So the back here, and there's even decorations in the binding. So there's like stamps in, the record says that this is sheep. It's sheepskin. So there's some, you can see it here, stamped in, just to make a little decoration. And then of course this great chain. One of the things I love about this one is that the experience of seeing it in person or in video is really made distinctive because of the chain. Because even though we photograph it, and if you look at the digital photos, that you can see the chain, but like having to deal with the chain when you're looking at it is sort of a different kind of thing. Just moving it around and hearing it clank and having to think about where it is when you're moving it is kind of fun. There's also, I didn't really point this out, but there's also on the edge, there's a buckle there that it's pretty tight. I'm not gonna do that. The fire probably made the parchment puff up a little bit, so it's a little thicker than it originally was. There we go. All right, it is past 12:30, so I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye. But thanks everybody for coming. This was really fun. I like this manuscript a lot, and I will hopefully see you again another time. So take care, everybody.